Hey, it's Unique History Channel. Today we're doing a reading from Our Sister Republics, United States in an Age of American Revolutions by Caitlin Fitz. We're reading Chapter 1, Squinting South. Born to a pair of Connecticut farmers in 1754, Joe Barlow became many things in his life: a Yale graduate, Continental Army chaplain, honorary citizen of Revolutionary France, and a U.S. consul in Tripoli. But above all, Barlow was a poet, a man of meter and rhythm. He's widely read The Vision of Columbus in 1787, an epic, The Columbiad, 1708, were the works in the heart, written as Barlow put it, from the most pure and ardent desire of doing good to my country. The Columbiad, in particular, was a patriotic poem. He explained, designed to encourage and strengthen the rising generation, a sense of the importance of the Republic institutions and the condition of nature good. In elaborate book-length verse, Barlow sang the glories of America. But Barlow's America did not stop at the Appalachians and the Alleghenies. It extended all the way to the Amazon and to the Andes, forming a united western world of patriotic potentials. Before so much as gazing to North America, in fact, Barlow began by invoking the sublime beauty of Quito and the Organil. That sweeping geographic vision benefited a pair of poems written in honor of Christopher Columbus, a man with special cultural appeal for the U.S. patriots who yearned to distinguish themselves from Great Britain. Although Columbus had never set foot in North America, he enabled people to identify with the area of colonization that predated the journeys of Englishmen like the great sirs Raleigh and Drake, and so he came to personify the nation's independent spirit. Poets like Phillis Wheatley employed the allegory of Columbia in 1770s and 1780s. King's College became Columbia College in 1784, and in 1800, the District of Columbia became the nation's capital city, a Republican political nucleus named not only for the United States' first president, but also indirectly for a Genoese Catholic who sailed for Spain. These early allusions to a liberty-loving Columbia derived from little more than a feeble sense of shared historical geography. Aside from those who lived near the United States' southern borders were Creeks, Seminoles, and other native people far outnumbered whites, Spanish and Portuguese America remained blurry stereotypes in the minds of most U.S. onlookers, equal parts El Dorado and Hernan Cortez, military rivals and imperial foils, more than political or cultural peers. The Iberian empires had minimalized foreign commerce for centuries, and although smuggling flourished anyway, contact between North and South Americans remained muffled and subdued. Interactions multiplied as the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon plunged Europe into a quarterly century of war, leaving Americans North and South to trade with each other relatively undisturbed. But it was not until the early 1800s, when the independence movements erupted across mainland Spanish America, that people throughout the United States began to develop genuine affinities for their southern neighbors. In fits and starts, the United States thus awakened to the world that stretched south of its borders, from Texas and Florida to Tierra del Fuego. If Barlow's expansion definition of America functions primarily as a poetic metaphor in the 1780s, by the early 1810s, the idea of a cohesive Western Hemisphere was bolstered by a growing web of political and economic cultural realities. In the beginning, there was trade. Ships dodgily through the Atlantic, their sails dotting otherwise mountainous oceanic horizon. Spain tried to stop them from crossing imperial lines, determined that the fabled wealth of the Indies should stay in Spanish hands rather than bleeding out to the godforsaken English or eventually their convening U.S. progeny. But the thirst for profit knows few national bounds. Where the money was to be made, men in all empires set aside regulations, commercial restrictions slowed the trade, but couldn't stop it. As Connecticut merchant put it, men learned to do business in the smuggling way, while pirates and sea dogs with their booty and their bluster did business the violent way. Goods and people trickled steadily between empires, grains, fish, and other edibles from North America, sugar, coffee, and cacao, precious metals from Spanish America, and African slaves all around. When the United States arrived on the scene, traders became eagerly re-exporters of European manufacturers, spreading foreign-made goods around the Atlantic Rim and increasingly beyond. Occasionally, the trade between the Anglophone and Iberian worlds operated more openly. Times of war, Spain periodically bowed to necessity by opening its American ports to neutral traders, fearing that its colonists might otherwise perish or revolt out of starving desperation. By 1797, Spain had grown so embroiled in European conflicts that it merely tolerated neutral trade for the better part of a decade. U.S. merchants happily offered their services. Within just 5 years of the new policy's implementation, the trade with Spanish America had multiplied by a factor of 4. Business quickened to such a degree that the modern U.S. dollar sign seems to have invoked this period of the shorthand for peso, which was increasingly like today's dollar sign as the merchants began to superimpose the P for the S. Most of the growing trade was with nearby Cuba, where sugar, coffee, and slavery were symbiotically booming after the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue slowed production in what had so recently been the world's leading producer. U.S. consumers wanted sweets, and U.S. merchants wanted gold and silver specie. While Cubans depend on the U.S. flour and other foodstuff, at last they starved to death amid their sprawling fields, walking in pain. Cubans also imported New England ice and snow, boatloads of the harrowing northern winter shoveled south to mitigate Cuba's endless summer. Meanwhile, despite the state and federal laws that forbade U.S. citizens from trafficking in enslaved Africans outside the United States, U.S. merchants, most of them from the North and Mid-Atlantic, did exactly that. In the first decade of the 19th century, U.S. citizens delivered some more 25,000 Africans to stoke Cuba's surging economy. It was sordid, but it was lucrative, enough to endear men to the ugliness of the enterprise. Taken together, in fact, Cuba trade buoyed the U.S. economy at a formidable moment. Spanish-American specie monetized U.S. banks at home and balanced out trade deficits abroad, all the while merchants and traders reinvested their winnings in domestic industry, banks, infrastructure, and a massive economy, multiplier effect rooted in offshore chattel slavery. Cuba was never the sole Spanish-American destination for U.S. ships. However, by the early 19th century, traders and sailors were venturing further afield. Some had looked across the Caribbean to Venezuela, contracting with Spanish colonial officials to supply food, weapons, and other supplies that had helped to sustain the empire at a time of disorder and scarcity. Others looked to regions more remote, sailing around Brazil and Cape Horn, the Pacific coast of Chile. There, they killed blubbery mammals and, on a astonishing scale, harpooning whales and sea elephants until the water rocks turned red. They had killed seals too in hundreds at a time, forcing the helpless creatures to run the gauntlet between men lined up in rows and armed with 5-foot clubs. U.S. participation in the transatlantic slave trade reached these distant climes as well. Half of the 22 U.S. ships arrived in Montevideo in 1805 carried enslaved Africans, and by 1807 the number had grown to 20 to 30. Coincident with the growing commercial interest was rising expansionist chatter among high-level policymakers who thought to extend U.S. power in North America and beyond. We ought to certainly look at the position of Florida and Louisiana. Alexander Hamilton advised to a colleague in 1799, and we ought to squint at South America. In 1801, Hamilton's nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, looked forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself between the current U.S. limits and cover the whole northern, if not southern, continent. Such talk represented a real threat to nearby Spanish territory. The United States bought Louisiana from France and Spain, and in 1803 added Florida by 1821 and took half of Mexico less than 3 decades later. The bluster about expansion to South America remained the stuff of the daydream, something easily imagined for distant times, but much harder as long national ambition outweighed national power. Cultural connections between the United States and Latin America were also deepening in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, though the awareness was usually remained superficial. Colonial British Americans had long relied on more fussy stereotypes about their southern neighbors than on actual experience. Only a few institutions and individuals owned many books on Latin America. The institutably curious Thomas Jefferson had dozens of relevant volumes in his personal library at Monticello, and East Coast iterates at the New York Historical Society, Harvard College, and Philadelphia's American Philosophical Society had collected literary and scientific information about Latin America through the 18th century, but these groups imported most of their titles from abroad. Colonial printers issued few, if any, books on Latin America, perhaps because they expected few, if any, people to buy them. At his college graduation in late 1771, the loud and husky Hugh Henry Breckinridge unintentionally summarized what most late colonial onlookers thought about Latin America, if they had thought about it at all. Cloaked and capped in a black gown and square that, he joined the president and trustees of the College of New Jersey as their feet crunched along the gravel walkway and up the stairs in stately Nassau Hall, and the coupled bells pealing in happy celebration. Aaron Burr, a precocious 15-year-old junior who had won prizes in English, Latin, and Greek oratory one day before, was in attendance. Graduating senior James Madison was out sick. Meanwhile, the ladies and gentlemen from Philadelphia to New York had descended on Princeton for the day, eager to witness the spectacle. After a series of formal debates and operations, Breckinridge rose to speak. He and his friend Philip Freneau, a New Jersey farm boy who would later become one of the most influential Republican newspaper editors in the country, had written an elusive celebration of the colonial potential entitled The Rising Glory of America. For some, Freneau, Madison's roommate, couldn't attend the ceremony, so Breckinridge read the whole poem himself, his Scots Burr surely commanding the whole and speculating widespread attitudes about Latin America among the way. For the first 2 or 3 minutes, he lyrically urged listeners to gaze no more upon classical antiquity or old Europe. He turned south, 8 lines gauzy rhetoric about the western world, the Americas, and the 4 lines to praise the hero Columbus, and then came the corpses and the blood. But why, thus happily found, should we resume the tale of Cortez, fierce chief ordained with Indian blood to dye the sands, and choke fammed the Amazonian stream with the dead? Better these northern realms deserve our song, unindulged with the seas of Indian blood, which cruel Spain on the southern region split. Why dampen the day's beauty and spirits? Latin America's colonial history was too gloomy to dwell upon. Breckinridge maintained better focus on Britain's more promising colonies. The audience seemed to agree, because when Breckinridge finished half an hour or so later, the buildings besieged Sanson walls echoed with applause. Breckinridge's vision was rooted in centuries-old stereotypes of Iberian depravity, later to be known as the Black Legend. The narrative was so persistent that it flourished even after Spain had aided the United States in the fight against Britain, and New Haven resident Jedediah Morse was part of the reason. In 1784, the 23-year-old first published his Geography Made Easy, calculators, he explained, particularly for the use and improvement of schools, and dedicated to the young gentlemen and ladies throughout the United States. The text cut like a razor. Their character is nothing more than a grave, suspicious, insignificant Morse rest of Spanish-American elites. Their business is amour and intrigue. Worse, Morse charged Spanish-American cruelty had transformed many native people into a dejected, timorous, and miserable race of mortals. Although many indigenous South Americans had converted to Catholicism, Morse dryly judged the exchange not for the better. No surprise that Morse's son, the future painter and telegraph inventor, Samuel Finley Breese Morse, would become famous for his anti-Catholic xenophobia. Morse's text spawned several related titles, and his collective opus became a runaway hit. The next several decades, sales in at least some of the places exceeded those of all the other texts, with the exception of Noah Webster's Spellers and Isaac Watts' Psalms and the Bible itself. Widening commercial horizons that followed Spain's 1797 neutral trade decree stirred cultural interest. Almost immediately, in 1798, a New York editor published a U.S. edition of the Scotsman's William Robinson's volume on Latin America. The usual stock figures made their appearances: rapacious conquistadors, lentious priests, and dying Incas. But a flurry of translated texts from Spanish America itself offered other perspectives. In 1801, a Salem editor announced that if 500 scars could be found, he would print Bernal Díaz de los Castelos' Historia Verdante de la Conquista de la Nueva España, in translation. He apparently got the response he was looking for. In 1803, the True History appeared in its first U.S. edition. 1 year later, a Philadelphia publisher issued Francisco Javier Galivero's History of Mexico, and so did a Richmond printer in 1806, the same year that Washington Irving translated the history of Venezuela from French into English. Even tiny Middletown, Connecticut contributed to the flow of information when in 1808 a local editor published the Jesuit missionary of Giovanni Ingonias Monila's Geographical and Natural Civil History of Chile. The mere fact that these texts suggested that U.S. readers were growing more interested in Latin America, and some of the books may even have fed early nationalists, whereas Clavijero and Molina had both celebrated the Western Hemisphere's potential, opening and feud European critics that the Americas and other things that lived there were important shells of the old world counterparts. But aside from Robertson's History of America, which U.S. newspapers expanded for decades, it was unclear whether any of the titles had very wide circulations. None were written by U.S. authors or for U.S. audiences. More information did not always mean more affection. Take the controversial Venezuelan visitor Francisco de Miranda, who arrived in the United States in late 1805. Determined to win support for his life's mission, liberating Venezuela from Spain, Miranda had spent the previous 2 decades in Europe scheming for support, and in Britain most of all, and in 1805 he gave up and turned to North American Republic. 55 years old, with a powdered gray ponytail and fidgety hands and feet, Miranda was old for an aspiring revolutionary general, but that did not stop him. He had always been more of a dreamer and a pragmatist. From federal warehouses in Springfield, New York City, and West Point, he stockpiled pikes, cannonballs, and mortars elsewhere. He obtained firearms, powder, and uniforms, and even inspired John Adams' grandson to drop out of college and enlist as an aide-de-camp. The former president was horrified when he found out, but I was too late, as he later wrote. I gave up my grandson as lost forever. Most merchants refused to back Miranda. They were already profiting from the trade with loyal Spanish officials in Venezuela and beyond. Newspaper editors who had less to lose were more encouraging. The United States of South America, like the United States in the North, will represent admiring Europe, another republic, independent, confederate, and happy. The Richmond Enquirer predicted after Miranda and his roughly 200 recruits finally disembarked in 1806. Newark, New Jersey's centennial freedom professed itself among those who wished him success and who gladly echoed in his triumphs. Manhattan, where Miranda did most of his recruiting, produced the loudest buzz of all, and where the Republican governor accused several prominent Federalists of having violated federal neutrality laws by supporting Miranda's scheme, a jury quickly acquitted them. The attention grew more critical as Miranda made his way to South. Recruits complained of harsh treatment aboard a ship and even mutinied unsuccessfully. A St. Patrick's Day celebration gone awry, they later tried to explain. Worse, when Spanish guardcostas intercepted the expedition of the coast off Venezuela, Miranda fled, abandoning 2 ships and about 1/3 of his men. Those unfortunate sailors were bound back to back, loaded with heavy chains, and disputed in the humid subterranean dungeons, where greasy, hairy, and increasingly emancipated, they sat in their own feces awaiting trial. 10 were eventually hanged and publicly decapitated with a chopping knife. One survivor grimly recalled. Those who managed to escape for the next several years returned to the United States with stories that reflected as poorly on Spain as they did the men who had tried to overthrow it. 3 recruits lashed out in telltale books. Editors who published over 450 discreet articles about the Miranda expedition denounced the would-be liberator as a megalomaniac fraud. It was a bumbling debacle, and it discredited early advocates of Spanish-American independence before a nation of readers. Among U.S. onlookers, before Spain's neutral trade decree of 1797 had triggered a desultory swell of commercial and cultural invests in Latin America, much of the attention was critical, and there was little other evidence that ordinary people knew or cared much about what was happening south of their borders. As late as 1810, editors were still struggling to explain the difference between Venezuela and Caracas, and the headlines the reader's New World Geography from Caracas, South America, when a tentative editor saw fit to explain. Another author, his words reprinted from Salem to Richmond, more in the sanctity geographical knowledge. here hetero in possession respecting these countries, then perhaps seeking to expand awareness, declare the immense regions are inhabited by only monkeys. We have, confessed the Baltimore Whig, no accurate account of the whole population. As Jefferson lamented in 1809, everything nearby Mexico had almost locked up from the knowledge of men hetero. It would take something else to kindle and then sustain popular excitement about Latin America. Much like Spain's 1979 trade declaration, that would something originate in catastrophically violent and war-torn Europe. In 1807 and 1808, Napoleon unleashed his wrath on Iberia. As if Europe were his chessboard, the French emperor invaded Portugal and then kidnapped the Spanish monarch, setting in motion a volatile string of events that over the next decade and a half gradually resulted in declarations of independence throughout Latin America, as well as growing curiosity from people in the United States. Napoleon's Iberian offensive began in late 1807. Early that year, in violation of France's continental system, the Portuguese monarchy had refused to entirely sever the nation's long-term mercantile commercial ties with Britain. France's response was swift and merciless. Napoleon ordered his famed Grand Army to march on Lisbon. Rather than that, Portugal's leaders chose flight, slipping away to Rio de Janeiro around a fleet of British ships just hours before French armies stormed into the capital. Several hundred carts rattled frantically to the waterfront, accompanied by more ladies and gentlemen than they could possibly fit abroad. The solidly outfitted fleet outraged locals, trembling at the prospect of French occupation, possibly the fugitives of Stone, and the Prince Regent, Dom Zhao, was purportedly reduced to tears and so panicked that he could scarcely walk. They left in such a hurry that nobody noticed that the church silver and the royal library's cherished books all left stranded in crates along the quay. Though born out of desperation, it was also for those inclined to silver linings a moment of excitement and expectation. For decades, a handful of prominent intellectuals and statesmen wondered if moving the imperial capital from Lisbon to Brazil might be just the thing needed to resurrect Portugal's once commanding global empire. Carpe diem, then now was their chance. In over 300 years of colonization, no European sovereign had so much visited an American colony. Now, Portuguese royals and over 10,000 courtiers were making a home there, settling down amid the monkeys and mango trees. As Boston's Columbian Centennial explained, Brazil's government has been colonial and now will be metropolitan. Almost overnight, Rio became an imperial city, the linchpin of a global empire that stretched from Angola and Mozambique to Guau and Machau. It didn't exactly ignite a wholesale Portuguese renaissance as some had hoped, but the monarchy's transatlantic relocation did endow 19th century Brazil with a measure of dynastic stability and geographic coherence that other parts of the Americas lacked. Of all the European empires that rose up in the New World, from British to French and Spanish and Portuguese, Brazil alone would remain in one piece following independence. Back in the United States, few seemed to panic at the thought of a sovereign monarchy establishing itself in America. President Thomas Jefferson immediately welcomed his great and good friend Dom Zhao to America, the great continent that the genius of Columbus has given to the world. With similar positivity, a New York editor reasoned that it is in vain to talk of free governments being formed by subjects of the old absolute monarchies, by people who know nothing about government but to obey. A stable, enlightened monarchy like Brazil's would be much better, and the Portuguese kingdom may in time, not the first, the least second great nation in America. Events in the Spanish Empire followed a bloodier course, while the Portuguese monarchs clung to sovereignty by aligning on America. Spain's royal family lost all semblance of power, promising to help the Spanish monarchs resolve a dynastic dispute. Napoleon lured them to France, captured them, and then forcibly imposed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne in 1808, replacing the House of Bourbon and with the House of Bonaparte. Few Spaniards were prepared to accept this outside pretender. Throughout the country, men and women rose in support of their kidnapped King Ferdinand V, forming an armed and largely grassroots resistance, which gave rise to the English word guerrilla. Napoleon was stunned. After one particularly bad defeat, he kept confusing, asking one of his generals to repeat what had unable to comprehend the loss. But he was too proud to retreat, and so the chaos deepened. The rapes, the plunder, mass executions, a somber testament to what the Spanish painter Francisco de Goya simply called Estrangos de la Guerra, the ravages of war. 250,000 people died in the Peninsular War, and the rest were left to pick up the pieces. Amid such shocking pandemonium, most U.S. newspapers emphasized in Europe rather than speculating about the fate of Spanish Americans' colony. Headlines were startling as they were shunted. Spain in an uproar. The attention of all, a New York editor explained, is drawn towards Spain while the rest of the world is contemplating the rapture of her efforts and resists to defeat the nefarious signs of Bonaparte. Few editors seriously complimented with the European tone it meant for Spanish America itself. Among those who did ponder the colony's futures, one idea prevailed. The provinces of Spanish America, New York's editor explains, is drawn towards Spain, are now without a king. A glorious time for the South Americans to make themselves independent. As Boston's Columbian Centennial resumed, Spanish Americans would declare themselves independent until Ferdinand would restore his throne. These writers had identified the central dilemma that confronted Spain and its American colonies. With Fernando V wildly in captivity and Joseph Bonaparte clashing with the popular guerrillas, a power vacuum emerged. Nobody was in control. In Spain itself, local governing communities or juntas, and a nationwide central junta sprang to fill the void, claiming to rule in Ferdinand's absence. With similar logic, Spanish Americans established their own juntas, and in some cases ousted local imperial officials, first in the Andean highlands in 1809, and then the following year in places such as Caracas, Buenos Aires, Santiago de Chile, Cartagena, and Santa Fe de Bogota. Spanish America's juntas all professed to act in the name of Ferdinando V. They were simply taking over, they said, until the rightful king resumed his throne. Such claims raised more questions than they answered. What did it mean to pledge allegiance to someone who was effectively powerless? Without a functioning monarch, were colonies simply planets without a sun, lurching and launching out of orbit into new, unpredictable paths of their own? Indeed, by swearing adherence to the captured Ferdinando rather than to the Spain's acting central junta, Spanish Americans suggested that their loyalty to the king did not extend to Spain itself. Sure enough, in 1810, a full-fledged popular rebellion had erupted in rural Mexico. A year later, Venezuelan radicals declared outright independence and wrote a republican constitution. Other provinces seemed on the verge of doing the same. Trying to prevent and stop the bleeding, Spain's central junta had invited Spanish Americans to send elected representatives to an imperial congress, or Cortes, held in Cadiz between 1810 and 1814. But Spanish delegates, struggling that they were under the ferocious rule of the brothers Bonaparte, refused to treat Spanish Americans as equals, which only turned Spanish Americans against Spain in greater numbers. The ravages of war that Goya had chronicled in Spain had spread grimly across the Atlantic, where the struggle for independence raged through 1825. There were many differences between Spanish American and U.S. independence. U.S. revolutionaries had been responding to assertion of power on the part of Britain's parliament and monarchy. Spanish Americans were responding in the absence of power of Spain. George III had been a victimizer in the eyes of many mainland colonies. Ferdinando was a victim. Unlike Spanish America, British America had a long history of religious pluralism, local representative government, and high white literacy rates, in part due to the vast territorial reach from the Atlantic Pacific from California to Cape Horn. Finally, Spanish American independence emerged on a regional basis without a singular or overreaching institution. In contrast, Britain's 13 colonies, at 1/10 the collective size of their Spanish American counterparts, united under one continental army and one continental congress and eventually one constitution, with much more difficulty, and only having to fail to pursue Canada and the British Caribbean to join in. Still, the similarities, rebels who call themselves Americans, and who were in some cases starting to invoke Republican principles, raised eyebrows in the United States. Curiosity mounted late in 1809 and early in 1810 when news of unrest in Quito appeared in every state. Even after royal authorities in Lima gained control, political upheaval over the following year continued to fuel U.S. interests. In the summer of 1810, news arrived at the Caracas City Council that ousted the region's presiding capital, General Gain, and named the exiled king. Because Fernando was, in the words of one New York newspaperman, a mere political non-entity, most editors interpret events in Spanish America as a preliminary sort of independence. Though loyalty to Ferdinand was professed, the Boston Patriot reason, an absolute and perpetual independence of Old Spain, was understood to be the real design. New York City Post hoped the whole system of Spanish America would be emancipated. From New England to New Jersey to Maryland, Virginia, and other editors happily agreed the people of this country, Venezuela, appear to have been their business rightly, and there is much to be hoped in their exertions. Even scattered and local governments throughout Spanish America began to declare full-blown independence. However, many U.S. observers remained skeptical. Merchants, as Miranda had already learned, were especially chary. The same violence that mangled Napoleonic Europe had brought gritty prosperity to the United States